Instead of jumping on the topic of the day, which seems to be whether Pope Francis likes having his ring kissed or not, I'm just going to let that one slide by. And the response to that question in short is yes, Pope Francis does seem to like having his ring kissed by certain people, just not normal Catholics by all appearances. I'm not sure what's going on in this image or what the context is, but then again, I am not capable of understanding what context is appropriate for a nearly naked gay man to be on his knees before the Pope. But what do I know? I'm one of the rigids that we've been warned about by the Holy See. Anyway, there's some extremely questionable news coming from the Church in Australia, and it has nothing to do with the conviction of Cardinal Pell, at least on the surface. It's a story involving the attempts to further democratize the Church, to further change the Church so that a different faith is being taught from country to country. It's a story that could, if this logic applied in other countries, lead to an attempt to destroy the universal faith through the preaching of a false gospel of egalitarianism. And in a related bit of news, a second story that I'll present shows just how badly modernism has infected the hierarchy of the Church. Buckle up, because these stories are so stupid that it hurts. But first I wanted to thank my patrons for their support of this channel. If you want to join them in supporting my work, there are links in the description below, including links to Patreon and Subscribestar, which is actually now up and running again. Also, I wanted to repeat my call for submissions for the blog, returntotradition.org. There have been a few articles posted by viewers and supporters like you, so please feel free to submit an article for the blog if you want to use the email address in the description below. I can't pay for them at this stage of things, but I do want to help get more Catholic voices out there doing this kind of work for the Church. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when the faithful have rejected the social reign of Christ the King, you only have to look towards efforts of promoting egalitarianism in the Church. The most obvious example of what I'm talking about is the promotion of democracy, be it among the lay faithful through greater participation in the governance of the Church, or even among the bishops through their thoroughly modernist practice of synodality. Other examples include when the bishops promote the values of the world on issues like alleged institutional racism in the West, combating patriarchy, promoting feminism, or among high-profile members of the laity when they promote laissez-faire capitalism or socialism or open immigration policy, or even through a distortion of Catholic social teaching. The problem of modernism has infected almost everyone in the Church today to some degree, which is why the news out of Australia is so mind-numbingly stupid. The Australian bishops are about to have their plenary council, the first in Australia in nearly 100 years, and only the third since the Second Vatican Council. A plenary council enables the laity to make proposals that, if signed off on by the Vatican, become binding on all the lay faithful in that country. Let's have a look at that story for greater details. Australian Church completes first phase of historic plenary council, as reported by the Catholic News Service. Sydney, Australia. The Australian Catholic Church has completed the first phase of its 2020 plenary council, in which lay people will be allowed to vote and decisions could be binding on the nation's Catholics, once ratified by the Vatican. I don't see any way that this could go wrong. The meeting's organizers have received more than 20,000 submissions from more than 75,000 Catholics around the country in a 10-month listening and dialogue process that finished March 13th. The landmark meeting that will take place in 2 Australian cities during 2020 and 2021 is already bringing to the surface debate about the role of the laity in the Church and other reforms that are becoming more urgent in the wake of the ever-growing global sexual abuse scandal. The Australian meeting will be only the third plenary council to be held anywhere in the world since World War II. The Philippines held one in 1991 and Poland in 1993. There were 3 plenary councils in the United States before 1884, but none since. The Australian Council was announced in 2017 during the 5-year Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. That inquiry documented decades of abuse by Catholic clerics, clergy from other faiths, and adults from non-religious institutions, and handed down its findings in October 2017. Some findings related to the administration of the Catholic Church and the formation of clergy, including a recommendation that the seal of the confession be removed for abuse cases. Of course the government wants to remove the seal of confession for abuse cases, and that's where it'll start, but that's not where it'll end. Around the start of the new millennium, the Australian bishops started discussing the possibility of some sort of national gathering to take up the challenge of St. John Paul II issued in his apostolic letter, Nova Millennio Inuente. Lana Turvey Collins, facilitator for the Plenary Council 2020, told Catholic News Service. The letter said the new millennium was a perfect opportunity for every church, nationally and on a diocesan level, to reflect on the faith and determine what pastoral actions to take in order to make Christ known and loved in today's world. A plenary council is the highest form of gathering of any local church. It has legislative and governance authority, and decisions made at the council, if approved by the Vatican, become binding for the Catholic Church in Australia. A synod does not have this legislative and governance authority. The Australian Church has been rocked by the sex abuse scandal, Royal Commission, and recent conviction of Cardinal George Pell to 6 years imprisonment for allegedly sexually abusing two 13-year-old choir boys. The Cardinal remains in jail, pending an appeal hearing in June. Jack de Groot, CEO of St. Vincent de Paul in New South Wales and chairman of the Implementation Advisory Group to Australian Bishops and Religious on Sex Abuse, said in many ways the country is a test case for the Church worldwide. The Plenary Council of the Church, it's only going to have credibility if lay people get to vote on its recommendation, and that they have at least half the vote, de Groot told CNS. There are still some bishops who have a default setting to the way things were, and that needs to change, he said. There are 5 million baptized Catholics in Australia and 800,000 kids in Catholic schools around the country. They need to be given permission to speak. They need to get some power within this voice. The question being asked of Australian Catholics, what do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time, has triggered a wave of responses among Australian Catholics and at least some of the Church's senior clerics. Some of the responses, quote, included the role of laity, feeling a sense of belonging in times when they've experienced rejection or judgment. People shared their experiences of sacraments and liturgy and their hopes for the experience of these to be faithful, inclusive, engaging, and spirit-filled, end quote, Turvey Collins said. She added that there was great diversity in how this could and should be achieved as people shared their experiences and hopes on topics such as women, leadership governance, church leadership and society on social issues such as ecological justice, homelessness, and radical compassion, quote-unquote, like Jesus was. Jesus, that well-known radical ecologist. Quote, I have been very moved by the stories of faith, hope, and resilience I have heard, end quote, per Archbishop Timothy Costello, Plenary Council President, said in a statement following the conclusion of the first phase. He explained there was, quote, no precedent for a national invitation to prayer, end quote, as well as dialogue and sharing of stories, which he described as a sense of stepping into the unknown and being unsure of what the experience might become. The first session of the 2020 Plenary Council will take place in Adelaide, the capital of the state of South Australia, in October 2020. In May 2021, a second session will be held in Sydney, the venue of the 1936 Plenary Council. For the next step, the Australian Bishops' National Centre for Pastoral Research will conduct a qualitative and quantitative analysis of the submissions received and, using best practice research methods, will identify key themes that have emerged. In May, the Bishops' Commission for the Plenary Council Executive Committee, and the facilitation team will work together with the National Centre for Pastoral Research to finalize the national themes for discernment. The themes announced June 9th will become the focus for the listening and discernment phase and will be the foundations for the Plenary Council agenda. If you want to read the rest of that hot mess for yourself, you can find a link on the Sources blog. A link is in the description to this video. Personally, I like that the 1990s are still referred to as post-World War II. But such silly references aside, I know that I said this already, but what could possibly go wrong? We know that the majority of Catholics have bought into economic and social Freemasonry, whether it's through adoption of libertarian economics or socialism, or through a belief that women should be ordained, that the two people of the same sex can somehow get married, and that there's nothing really wrong with most issues of sexual morality outside of actually cheating on your spouse, and in some circles even that's debatable. The research data bears this out. And yet the Church in Australia is going to permit the laity in one of the countries with the most lax laity to make binding decisions on everyone in that country. And people wonder why the SSPX are still around and unwilling to regularize their relationship with the Vatican. These are the kinds of decisions that cause many people to leave the Church altogether. with some making foolish choices like joining Eastern Orthodoxy, which is neither orthodox nor even free from many of the same problems facing the Catholic Church today. Now, you might be thinking, so what? This is Australia, not the Vatican, and Australia isn't exactly a hotbed of Catholicism. This is part of a larger problem, namely the Church adopting the values of the world instead of being salt and light in the world. And this is no more evident than in our second story. As reported by Vatican News, the Holy See just stated that the Church is committed to integral ecology of indigenous people. What does that mean? Quoting the story directly, and likely quoting the bishop most involved in this directly, one Archbishop Bernardino Auza of the Philippines, the Holy See's permanent observer to the United Nations in New York. He says, integral ecology is, and I quote, a call urgently for a new solidarity between the various sectors of the human family, but in a very special way with the indigenous peoples, particularly in the Amazonia. To me, that sounds like a call for globalism that tends to include the indigenous peoples of the most poor parts of the world. But let's keep going. Okay, so what does integral ecology actually mean? In practice, it means the partnering of the Vatican with the UN on issues related to the people of Amazonia. Amazonia is sort of, Brazil and that sort of part of South America. That should terrify all faithful Catholics, due to the UN having an open policy of population control, with groups like the indigenous peoples of Africa, Amazonia, Asia, and pretty much anywhere there are large numbers of vulnerable poor people as their primary audience. If you could try to imagine this, try to imagine a Catholic organization partnering openly with Planned Parenthood for something that isn't ostensibly related to abortion. And that's kind of what you get here. That's not to suggest some of this is some sort of racist agenda. The developed world, comprising North America, Europe, Russia, China, Japan, and parts of South America, have long since adopted formal or informal policies of population control through fully embracing a contraceptive mentality. Just think about how many Catholics are using contraception because of my personal conscience, and you get the idea. Pope Francis had recently spoken on the integral ecology of indigenous peoples of Amazonia and similar places, saying that the indigenous peoples of various places are at risk of the predations of global multinational business. That's certainly true, but notice that there's a distinct lack of the gospel in this and similar messages. Certainly, when poor people are abused by powerful people, we should all speak up. But where's the call to conversion? It's noticeably absent and, frankly, has been for some time now. We cannot view this call for so-called integral ecology without viewing it in the light of false ecumenism that dominates the Church today. Nor can we view it through the desire of the Church to get along with the world. Thus, all the challenges to un-Catholic economic systems, be it economic liberalism or socialism, falls on deaf ears because it is utterly divorced from the gospel, as often is the condemnation of exploitation and oppression of indigenous peoples. What I'm saying isn't an advocacy here for liberation theology. In that distorted system, the Church becomes political activists in line with a clearly Marxist ideology that completely reimagines Jesus Christ as a revolutionary, if you can wrap your head around that one. Maybe I should do a video on liberation theology and how it's been condemned by the Church and why. The Church's primary job is to spread the gospel for the salvation of souls. That does come with some political consequences to it, including speaking against disordered political and economic systems. But the problem comes in when the Church tries to substitute one worldly government or economic system for another, especially when Catholics try to baptize those systems. Keep that in mind when you see Catholic commentators try to make a pitch for their preferred worldly economic or political system, especially when it's rooted in Freemasonry. There's no difference between that and the Pope being cozy with questionable regimes and promoting condemned economics under the guise of integral ecology or sustainable development or social justice. Those are all worldly systems, as are often the systems used to argue against them. This seems lost on the Holy See today, as evident by the declaration of the Archbishop to the UN on this issue. Archbishop Auza said the UN program focuses on issues of justice tied to economics and social development, culture, the environment, education, health, and human rights. This is clearly a disordered view of justice and rights, and it reeks of Masonic influence. In a previous era, the Church would have sent missionaries, monks and nuns mostly, to work with the local peoples, and they would help them defend themselves against outside predators. This is plenty of examples in history of that. Then again, you'll be hard-pressed to find a more Masonic organization than the United Nations, save perhaps the Acton Institute in the United States. Archbishop Auza listed a series of values promoted by the Holy See for the Amazon, all of which point to greater democratization and liberalism. If you've listened to any of the encyclicals I've uploaded on the weekends, you'll know that those have been condemned for their roots in Freemasonry. We live in Mason world, or clown world if you prefer, and there seems to be no escape from this funhouse. For once, it would be nice to have a forum of the bishops and the Pope that was focused on the gospel, the honest, real gospel, not something that looks like globalism carrying a cross. Wouldn't that be nice? As always, thank you for listening and for your support. Pray and do acts of penance for the liberation and exaltation of the Church. I'm Anthony Stein. Ave Maria.